It's always very exciting for the Institute when one of our members publishes a new book. And it's especially exciting because this is the first book talk that Sarah Kovner will be giving since her book came out. Her book, Prisoners of the Empire, Inside Japanese POW Camps. We're also very lucky to be joined by a very special person, Barak Kushner. Barak Kushner is Professor of East Asian History, Chair of Japanese Studies, Department of East Asian Studies, Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Cambridge. And that is quite a mouthful. Dr. Kushner received his bachelor's from Brandeis and his PhD from Princeton. And he is the author of 3 books, including Men to Devils, Devils to Men, Japanese War Crimes and Chinese Justice, A Culinary and Social History of Ramen, Japan's Favorite Noodle Soup, and lastly, The Thought War, Japanese Imperial Propaganda. So welcome from all of us, Dr. Kushner.
It's hard to, should I take over now?
Yes, you can. You can introduce Sarah and we can get underway.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you all from the UK. It's a little warm, so I'm not wearing a jacket this evening, but thank you for inviting me. And it's a real pleasure to be able to introduce one of my colleagues. And I always felt that we needed musical introductions before great speeches, and I think we've just done that here. And that rousing kind of applause is a great way to also introduce Dr. Sarah Kovner. Sarah Kovner is a senior research scholar at the Arnold A. Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University. She has been a fellow in international security studies at Yale University and a tenured associate professor of history at the University of Florida. Her first book, Occupying Power, Sex Workers and Servicemen of Post-War Japan, was a choice outstanding academic title, and it won the Best Book Prize of the Southeast Conference Association for Asian Studies. She has been published in numerous journals, including the Journal of Asian Studies, the Journal of Women's History, and Diplomatic History. Her work has also been translated into Japanese and Chinese. She received, I noticed it's an AB from Princeton. They'd like to do it a little differently, not a BA. So she received her AB from Princeton and her PhD from Columbia University, and she has studied at Kyoto University and the University of Tokyo. She's an active member of numerous professional associations, including the Association of Asian Studies, the American Historical Association, and the Society for Historians of Foreign Relations. We share a long history of friendship, and also years ago when I had more hair and it was less white, days of carousing in various interesting bars in Tokyo as well. But time has passed on, and of course, we've both matured, although I think I look older, much older than, of course, Sarah does, which is not very fair. I have the book in front of me here. It's an exciting book. It's very interesting. It's also a very challenging read because it challenges many of our preconceptions of the history, and I think we're going to hear about that from Sarah first in her book presentation and book launch, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A following her excellent talk. Thanks again.
So thank you for the kind words, Ingrid, and thank all of you for coming. I see lots of familiar names, and if not faces. And I'd like especially to thank Barak, who has organized important conferences in Leiden and Cambridge. And the papers I wrote for those conferences really helped me work out some of the main ideas of the book. Slide 2. He's also a terrific, is this working? It's not showing up. Okay.
Yeah, here we go.
Okay, cool.
He's just starting. Give him a sec. Yeah.
All right.
We don't want to get ahead of your slides. Let's see. There we go.
That's the next one. Okay, great. So he's also a terrific host, and you can get a sense just of how much fun those conferences were from those photos. And I promise you we'll raise our glasses again in person one day. So the challenge I faced when I first began working on this project seemed almost insurmountable. First, the immense scale of the subject. Slide. So Japanese forces were fighting over thousands of miles of open ocean, from the Aleutians to the Straits of Malacca, from the Marshall Islands to the Burma Road. In the first 5 months of the war, they took prisoner hundreds of thousands of Allied servicemen and civilians from more than a dozen countries. So if you take a look at the map to your left, it's hard to even make out the hundreds of red dots that show where the camps were. So hundreds of POW camps, hundreds of civilian internment centers, and hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war and civilian internees. Second, many people assume that this immense and immensely complex history is incredibly simple and often don't want to be told otherwise. Slide. So this is a sophisticated crowd, and you may not have taken the time to read Laura Hillenbrand's bestseller Unbroken or seen the Angelina Jolie film. But the great majority of people know about this subject from films or semi-fictionalized accounts, like The Bridge on the River Kwai, or video games like Call of Duty. The story is almost always the same. The courage and resilience of Allied POWs in the face of the inexplicable cruelty of guards and camp commanders. Slide. So even World War II history buffs tend to have a relatively simple understanding, often summed up in casualty statistics. So if you take a look at Table 1, which shows the total number of POWs, number of deaths, and death rate per country, no doubt these statistics are horrendous, and the stark numbers represent an incalculable amount of suffering. Slide. But when you drill down, it turns out that even seemingly basic information, like the number of American POWs and the number of fatalities, proves to be elusive. To give you a sense of this, take a look at Table 2, which shows 3 different numbers from 3 different sources, and this is just of American POWs. The disparities reflect basic questions that are seldom addressed, like who counts as an Allied POW? And whether we should include the many Chinese, Filipinos, and forced laborers held captive or forced to work by the Japanese. And should Japanese be held responsible for all of these deaths? It turns out that more than half of the fatalities resulted from friendly fire. For example, Allied attacks on transport ships or Allied bombing of Japanese cities. For all of the thousands of books written about the suffering and death of POWs, almost all of them without the authors reading Japanese sources, no one has asked why POWs had to endure such terrible experiences. Slide. So my book attempts to answer this most basic question, which is also the most important question. To find the answers, I visited archives in Japan, South Korea, India, Switzerland, which is pictured here, Australia, Netherlands, Great Britain, Ireland, India, and of course, the US. Just some of the military archives I visited include the Australian War Memorial and a regimental museum near Manchester. And I also interviewed former guards and POWs and listened to oral history records. But to answer why specific abuses occurred in specific places, we have to go back to the earlier history of how Japanese treated POWs. If there's something intrinsic in Japanese culture, we should expect to find it here. Slide. Okay. In 1905, Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. This victory shocked the Western world and granted Japan entry into the club of powerful nations, powerful civilized nations in the language of the time. During that war, 80,000 Russians were taken prisoner by the Japanese. And so how were they treated? Well, the Japanese treated Russian POWs far better than the Russians treated the some 2,000 Japanese POWs held captive. Some were given servants, others were taken trips on hot springs. And this postcard that you see before you shows a garden party. Slide. The Japanese apparently even taught illiterate Russian POWs how to read. So obviously there's a propaganda element to this in the postcards I've shown you. But we do have objective outsider accounts because foreign volunteers worked in Japanese hospitals and reported what they saw. Japanese were also known for how well they treated German POWs during World War I. Some Germans were so happy in Japan, they decided to stay there and not to return home. To be given a small example, the German POW orchestra at Bondo became famous, the first to perform Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in Japan. And now it is performed every June to mark this occasion. So how can we account for the shift from the treatment of prisoners to the treatment of POWs during World War II? As I mentioned, during the early part of the 20th century, Japan sought to follow international law to demonstrate the extent to which they were in a civilized and cultured country. Slide. Okay, here's a quick overview. So if you take a look at the map, for now, think about how a faction of the Imperial Army began to gain power in the 1930s. They wanted domestic revolution and military expansion in Manchuria. This is a familiar story for many of you attending this, but for those who don't know, I'm going to go over it a bit. So remember that Japan has been seeking to expand its empire since the end of the 19th century. In the 1930s, Japan and China are at war. And also in the 1930s, Japan saw 4 attempted coups and saw 4 high-level political assassinations. And Japan announces it's leaving the League of Nations and began to care much less about impressing the West. Turning to what happened in 1941 and 1942, when the Japanese invaded Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, field commanders never expected so many Allied soldiers to surrender so quickly. In all 3 theaters in a period of months, and in some cases, like in Singapore, just a few weeks, they suddenly found themselves with responsibility for huge numbers of Allied POWs and internees. The Japanese who planned these operations had given little thought to the problem these POWs would pose. They simply weren't a priority. There was no plan, no protocol, no manual, and no one truly in charge of caring for POWs. Slide. Good. Okay, so take a look at the chart of the chain of command. And this is just one version I found in the archives, and lots of Allied archives there are. I kept finding the same document. And it comes from when the Allies were trying to figure out who was in control. The key at the bottom right shows what the arrows and dotted lines mean. The thickest arrows are the chain of command, the thin arrows indicate an indirect connection, and the dotted lines show what were supposed to be flows of information. And the circles indicate some of the agencies I'm going to be talking about soon. And if you find this confusing, you're not wrong. It shows how the chain of command was completely tangled up. Slide. So when we zoom in, you can see how the POW camps had multiple intersecting lines of authorities. In 1941, the Japanese set up the Prisoner of War Information Bureau to create ID cards, lists of POWs, and to transmit this information to the ICRC to fulfill their treaty obligations. Soon after, the Prisoner of War Management Office was set up to manage logistics. The same person was supposed to be in charge of both organizations, but he wasn't in the chain of command, had no command authority, and few personnel working for him. He could merely advise the War Ministry and set guidelines for camp commanders. Slide. Great. Okay, so this agency failed in its most basic function. It wasn't even able to keep track of the numbers and locations of POWs. So for instance, when at the end of the war, they provided lists of camp locations to the Allied occupation authorities, like the ones you see here, the lists turned out to be incomplete and inaccurate. Part of what makes this also difficult for many to understand, and certainly did for the Allies at that time, is that Japan was a signatory to the Geneva Conventions. So at an official level, at least, there was a conception of how prisoners of war ought to be treated. So why didn't this message get through? Japan ratified what we now think of as the first 2 conventions, and they signed the 3rd, although they didn't ratify it. And they weren't the only ones not to do so, by the way. They even agreed to follow them mutatis mutandis, meaning depending on circumstances. But even the few officers who knew about the Geneva Conventions lacked the capacity to abide by them. Imperial planners never thought through what resources the empire needed to expand, and this created a series of dilemmas for a military unprepared to provide adequate logistics or labor. In 1942, the Army Ministry decided that Allied POWs should be used to address manpower shortages in Japan and its growing empire. Prime Minister Tojo commented in May 1942 that the present situation of affairs in this country does not permit anyone to be idle. This decision subjected POWs to dangerous ocean voyages and harsh working conditions. We tend to think of the POW experience as being static, men confined to a camp. But in fact, POWs were often on the move from camp to camp, and it was these journeys, rather than the long periods of confinement, that brought the greatest danger. They were dangerous because these waters were increasingly under the control of Allied ships and aircraft, and the ships themselves were overcrowded, disease-ridden, and lacked sufficient supplies. Slide. Okay. So in the map on the left, which is in my book, you see the huge number of POWs were transported and how these voyages became increasingly dangerous. And on the right, you see the back of one Dutch prisoner's diary recording his journey from place to place. This one prisoner experienced at least 6 different camps and hospitals and ships along the way. So this meant that the experience differed dramatically. We're more familiar with stories of atrocities from the Philippines and the Burma Thai Railway, and these happen. But there was a range of experiences, and life in some camps in Japan and in what's now South Korea could be better. We know this by examining archival records and diaries. Slide. Okay. So take Korea. This is a drawing that one POW made. Camps there were Spartan, lacked sufficient food, and could have harsh climates, but still some compared favorably to others. Slide. So, for example, in Keijo and Seoul, officers farmed potatoes, vegetables, raised hogs and rabbits. And you see that in this, this photo that is now in the Australian War Memorial. The camp commanders struggled to find work for all of these prisoners, and they were paid. But this was because there were few large-scale civil engineering projects in Korea at that time that POWs were meant to work on. So after the end of the war, the British officer in charge, Colonel Ellerington, concluded that the fault, this is a quote, fault lies with the system rather than the individual. And by this, he meant that as much as we tend to focus on the evil camp commander and guards, and some of them were evil, it was the system as a whole that led to so much starvation. In fact, there was no system for ensuring camps were provided with adequate direction and logistics. Slide. Slide. Okay, good. So we see this in the way archival records from the camp show a focus on shrinking male bodies. And first, you can see here this drawing of men being weighed. Slide. And in this image, which is just one of several charts that records how captives lost weight, how captives recorded their own loss of weight. What's interesting about this one is the variation. You might expect a downward slope, but this prisoner's weight rises and falls with the camp conditions. He loses weight, but gains it when the Red Cross parcels come and when there are vegetables. But for prisoners, it wasn't just the deprivation. Part of what made the experience so traumatic for Australians and Americans and British, even when conditions were more tolerable, is that they were being held captive by men they considered their inferiors. Wartime accounts on both sides show the enemy as members of an inferior race, if not another species. Slide. Okay, so take a look at this woodblock print of a Korean guard and an Australian captive. They had little experience with each other and didn't speak each other's language. Most Japanese and Korean guards had never encountered a non-Japanese speaking foreigner and thought they were being defiant when they didn't immediately follow orders. But many American, Dutch, and British Empire troops had never before encountered Asians as anything but colonial subjects. Some commanders encouraged guards to use corporal punishment because bigger and stronger European and American soldiers would otherwise be impossible to control. But it wasn't a matter of policy. In fact, more than 80 Japanese soldiers were court-martialed and punished for mistreating POWs. Although many POWs and internees held what we would now consider racist views and were particularly humiliated to become prisoners of the Japanese, none could survive without gaining at least some understanding of their captors. They made distinctions between better and worse guards and camp commanders. This seems unbelievable to many today, but many showed empathy for the suffering of civilians outside the camps, who sometimes seemed even worse off than they were. Slide. So after doing all of this research and thinking about these problems for many years, I end up here. We think of war crimes as being intentional, as being committed by evil people. But some of the worst experiences come about through poor planning. And in this case, the leadership just didn't care. There's nothing inherent to Japanese character or culture that led to the inhumane treatment of POWs. My book shows that Japanese government and military never made it policy to abuse POWs, and the horrors of captivity were mainly due to negligence and bureaucratic incompetence. To me, what is so shocking is how senior officials gave much less thought to their management than today's accounts assume. It was Japanese inattention to the challenge of managing POWs and lack of interest in caring for them that led to many of their cruel and inhumane situations. But what stands out in the Japanese military's approach to POWs is its unwitting cruelty. So thank you very much.
Right. Thank you so much. That was terrific. Before we get underway with the Q&A, I just want to remind everyone to keep yourself muted. If you need to ask a question, which we would really love, just raise your hand and we will call on you and unmute you and turn on the video. All right, Barak, do you have some comments you want to make first?
I would be remiss if I didn't. Josh Fogel wrote an interesting review a number of years ago, and I think the title of the review is, you should beware of taking on a topic so large that no one would dare do it alone. And in some ways, you demonstrated the monstrosity of what this topic is for two reasons. One, for the number of archives that you have to go visit in order to get an understanding of Japan's imperial spread, and then what that means for the movement and the kind of the scope of what it was to be a POW within the Japanese Empire. But secondly, because you are arguing against a very entrenched Anglo-Saxon idea of what the war meant for prisoners of war. And as we shift into, slowly into the question mode where the miracle technology of Zoom may or may not work, I wonder if I can pose two questions to you just to get our thinking kind of juices flowing. The first is about the idea of war responsibility. So on one hand, you, in your book, which I had the opportunity to read obviously ahead of time, and so I'm not sure if other members of the audience have, and that's why I'm going to start from the beginning of the book. I'm going to have a question kind of from the back. But in thinking about this idea of war responsibility, so the Japanese military historian Fujiwara Akira said many years ago, similar to you, the Japanese military was poorly organized, and this led to a lot of problems. Okay, and you have agreed with him and moved our scope of historical vision over to the POW side. But at the same time, the Japanese, as you know from your own archival digging, really pushed back against the Red Cross for years. I think Marcel, as you know, doesn't make it until what, August 1st, 1945, to his first Manchukuo POW camp. And then, of course, the Japanese military is keen to burn all the documentation it can. So even though they're disorganized, they're very knowledgeable about what has happened and what they did. Can you tell us a little bit about how you deal with this question of war responsibility in contrast to the disorganized military, the cruelty as a byproduct of inadvertent attention rather than a cultural trait? So that'll be my first question.
Okay, I wasn't not sure. Oops, can you hear me? It says I'm muted. All right, I thought you were gonna ask both questions, but I'll go with this one. All right, so I think that's a great question. For those who don't know, Jeannot is the head of, later becomes the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, and he has a checkered reputation, I think, these days in that role, although he's very famous for many years, at least that is according to the archivist of the ICRC. All right, so, I think and I would say more responsibility, I would think you would have that answer better than I would, but I think that it's tricky, right? I think the way that I deal with it in my book is I have a chapter on the war crimes trials, and I look at how the actors in the book thought about it at that time. In terms of the burning, I think what you said is dead on right, though. They knew what was going on. The head of the Prisoner of War Information Bureau himself visited camps. That's right, and he knew what was going on there. And in addition, so you mentioned the role of the ICRC, who's sending inspectors, wants very much to send inspectors to all of the different camps, and was prevented, right, from sending inspectors to camps outside of Japan, Korea, and Manchuria. And these are the people who are working for the ICRC in Japan, right, and local representatives. And although some of them went, and even when they went, and I think people maybe know this, it's not as if they were allowed to go around unfettered and without supervision. They always had to talk to, when they were able to talk to the Allied POWs, they were closely supervised when they did it. And in the reports that were sent out, those were of course censored, right? So it's a little bit tricky, but I think that, I guess I would say that, I guess the question of war responsibility depends on where you're standing, and if you take the example of the head of the Prisoner of War Information Bureau, this is the way that I thought about it when I was writing my book. So if you have somebody without power who is put on trial for doing things, right? So this is a person who's supposedly in charge of prisoners of war, and yet he had no actual power to change things. And so how that story ends up is that he is accused of committing a crime, but he doesn't have to go to jail for very long. And this was deeply unsatisfying to many people at the time. And I guess that the question of war responsibility looks really different depending on where you're standing and at what time you're looking at it. So question 2.
Thanks. And I see that we have some blue hands up. We had a blue hand up slowly, but hopefully the blue hands will continue to come out as they hear the next question and thoughts percolate forward on our international Zoom. In following your argument through the book, and I mean, it's a very different way of thinking about war responsibility than I have, but I think when you're looking at POW camps specifically as you are, I think that's an important issue to consider. You talk toward the end of your book, and I'll skip to that just kind of to push future readers then to think about getting through the whole book and finding what you're leaving for us in a sense, almost dangling at the end. And I think you kind of have 2 criticisms at the end. The more obvious criticism is US policy in the war on terror and lessons learned from World War II. And I'll let that hang there perhaps if you want to address that in some ways, because you start obviously with World War II, but you end the book almost in the contemporary era with what we're facing internationally. But one of the things that you say in your conclusion is that the trials treated, and in this you're referring to the war crimes trials, both I assume the Tokyo trial and of course the BC class trials all over East and Southeast Asia, where all these POW camps were. You say the trials treated history as a hanging judge. And then you kind of move forward a bit. But I'm wondering if you can develop that idea a little bit more, or pull us into what where is really the criticism then connecting war responsibility, the atrocities, the abuses of the POWs, perhaps the memory of the trials. What did you see by writing that statement?
I'm not sure exactly what context that's in, but let me talk a little bit about how I got interested in writing this book and what I meant, or how I think about those questions. So, when I began researching this book, it seems like a long time ago now. I guess it was a long time ago. This is a context in which what was in the American newspapers and all over the world is the way that the question of just who counted as a prisoner of war and who didn't, and that this designation, for those of you who don't know, being called a prisoner of war brings with it specific treaty obligations, and that is something that the U.S. has not, despite what many say, at least in my view, has not always accorded to those it holds captive, right? And so this is what I was reading about, and then I got interested in, for a number of reasons, in Japanese history and in these Allied POWs. And when I started reading more about that, and then I found out that people who were actually held prisoner as by the Japanese during World War II went on to negotiate the 1949 Geneva Conventions, I started thinking about how the experience that they brought being held captive influenced what they, influenced the writing of those conventions. And yet and still, if you talk to prisoners of war now, this is something that I've been reading about in one of the POW discussion groups that I'm in, is you have people who are 98 years old now making political ads talking about how they were kept as prisoner of war and how disturbing they find contemporary events. And so that I think that history is with us now. But the way that we as we judge it has changed. I hope that is a sufficient answer to your question.
It's a good start, and I think that will link to our other questions. I see a very patient blue hand initially from Dr. Lori Watt, who I think is in St. Louis right now. And then we have another one following Dr. Watt from James Paisley, who is a SEPA student. Dr. Watt?
We have to unmute you. There you go.
Yes, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. There you are.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Nice to see Sarah. Nice to see Barak. Thanks very much to the organizers for hosting this marvelous event. And I see lots of old friends up there, so I just wanted to say hello. I'm aware from Twitter that the attacks on Sarah's book have already begun. I'm really sorry that this is happening. I know that many of the people in the audience share my sentiment, but I just wanted to say hats off for writing such a brave and informative book. And again, thanks to Barak for serving as such an important interlocutor for this project. What my first question was going to be about Tamara and the Prisoner of War Institutional Bureau. This was an organization that I had never heard anything about, so I was really interested in how you were able to identify this new and, to me, unknown bureaucracy. So that was really fascinating. You touched on that already, so I did want to ask you, another interesting element of this book is the role of Swiss and Swedish intermediaries, often through the ICRC. And I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about your journey of discovering the important role that these folks played in this history. This is what makes your book into an international history, or it's international in many ways. But if you could just tell us a little bit about that book, especially maybe for people who haven't had a chance to engage with what you're working on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question, Lori. All right, so the person that I was talking about in the war crimes trial in address to Barak's question was, his name is Tamna. He's running one of the agencies that I showed on my organization chart, the Prisoner of War Information Bureau. And while it's true, as Barak also alluded to, that many of the documents at the end of the war were burned, those of the agencies that were responsible, or many of those of the agencies that were responsible for managing and organizing prisoners of war were not burned. And so these are one of the sources that I use to figure out what's going on for Allied prisoners of war. But I'm going to focus on some of the other things that you mentioned, mostly. So the role of the Swiss, right? So the reason I wrote an article on this, mostly because I think many of us have had this experience, I wanted to understand something that I didn't know about. As a Japan historian, somebody who's trained in Japanese history, I didn't know very much. I knew virtually nothing about Swiss history. And when I found that the role of the ICRC, who are these people who are visiting these camps, I wanted to know more. And who these people are. The International Committee of the Red Cross holds responsibility for visiting prisoners of war. There are several ways in which they're important, but also the Swiss government serves as a protecting power during this period, and the Swedish for civilians. And one of the things that I found in this research is that prisoners of war and civilians are often kept in the same camps, which was not how it was supposed to be done, but they were. And this meant that the ICRC, which is a Swiss organization, despite being an international organization, it employs Swiss people. They worked together very closely. And this required many a trip to Geneva, which you saw the picture of earlier on in my slide. And I really wanted to figure out what protecting power was and how these Swiss men understood this history and how they navigated understanding what was going on. And I found that, I guess not really to my surprise, but more than I thought, that Swiss national interest became very important for these people, as they were like, so that the Swiss government, who is serving as being responsible for all these civilians, lots and lots of different civilians in Asia at this time, they are responsible for visiting the camps, but they're also very concerned about Swiss national interests. And so trying to figure out how this all worked kept me busy for a long time. And as for your first comment, I think that, you know, I knew that I was going to get a lot of blowback on this book, and it has started, and I get it from all sides, right? And I was prepared for that, but the reality of it is maybe more exciting than I could have imagined. So thank you for the question, Lori.
Before we move to James Paisley and his question, and then I note that, and I'm probably going to mispronounce, Jim Dingman will be up. If people who are posing questions could just state their affiliation for the whole group on the international Zoom, then we can know each other a bit more. I mean, since the trolling and the Twitter has come up, one of the interesting comments in one of your more aggressive fans' accounts said that you've taken on the Japanese understanding of the issue. And that statement struck me because it seems that that person didn't really understand that a lot of the vanguard research about POWs and that we all use comes from Japan. Do you want to maybe, I mean, I'm sure half the people in the audience are quite familiar with this because they're Japan specialists, but there might be a number of people in the audience who aren't. Do you want to talk about the role that Japanese language scholarship plays for you in your own research?
Yeah, okay, so I think I should first introduce what everybody's talking about. Basically, I got some hate mail and I posted it to Twitter to see what everybody thought that I should do. And I got a really wide range of responses because I have many people who follow me who are interested in international law. And so that was educational for me. And I appeared on a BBC radio program. And so some people heard it and they had a lot of feedback from me. I also got some really nice messages on it, so I appreciate that. I want to highlight that not all of the people who listen to me hate me. I've also been on a lot of radio shows, conservative radio shows all over, and so I am hearing a wide range of feedback. But in terms of how Japanese history, you know, Barak is absolutely right that Japanese historians have really influenced me, and they are some of the people doing the vanguard of this research. I would be remiss not to mention Utsumi Aiko, who many of us have read and who runs has written many books and also has a website that she runs with a bunch of other people who are really committed to doing the local research that is important in understanding this, so that it's a huge organization that works with many, many people. And she, in one of her books, she interviews a guard and tries to chart his journey. So I think that most of what I've said today in terms of historiography has to do with the way that we in the United States or Australia or wherever are understanding this information. I don't think that's true necessarily of historiography in Japan, but I wanted to present those comments so that to make sense of what I'm talking about for the American audience. But so yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. James Paisley, can you unmute and make yourself visible?
Thank you, Dr. Kovner. My name is James. I'm a second-year ISP student here at Columbia University. I'm one of the research assistants at Saltzman as well. I've been doing a lot of research recently on the Pacific War, particularly in regards to the naval battle outcomes between the IJN and the Allied forces from 1941 to 1945. And one of the things that becomes apparent, particularly later in the war, is that as ships are sunk, sailors are not saved. I imagine that there's a gradual decline in POWs that are captured by the IJN later in the war. But I was wondering if there was a qualitative difference in the treatment of POWs that are captured by the IJN versus the IJA. I noticed in the diagram that you showed earlier that there is a different chain of command that all leads to the temporary camps, and that the POWs that are submitted by the IJN are separate from those that are submitted by the Army. So I was wondering if you could talk if there's any kind of qualitative difference that you noticed there.
Hello. It's funny, I thought your question was going one way and then it went another way. So I'm gonna lead with where I thought you were going and then answer your second question. And if you're interested in the naval battles, and one of my slides, I'm trying to figure out which number it is currently. It's one of the maps that appears in my book. It's slide 14. You don't need to bring it up, but that shows how many Allied POWs died in the naval campaigns. That's not specifically what it's titled, but that's basic. That's how they're moved around. But one of the shocking things to me that I found out when I was researching this book, again, not surprising, but still shocking, is the ways that even though the Americans and the British and knew that Allied POWs were on these ships, they bombed them, right? Again, it makes sort of a strategic and tactical sense, but it's still somewhat surprising to me. And it may be to others. In terms of the camps that are held by the IJA and the IGN, what my book does is it traces the experience of 5 particular camps, and they're all Army camps. There are a couple of reasons for that, but one is that there are very, very few camps, Navy camps, and therefore my book doesn't cover them.
Thank you.
Was there a second part that you wanted to respond to, Sarah, or was that the full?
No, I mean, the first part where I thought he was going was the question of what happened, why so many people died in the end of the war. And part of that is because many, many, many people died in the bombing of these ships, and not just by their ships being bombed, but also, the journey of trying to get out of there. I'm thinking primarily about some of the ships. These are ships going from the Philippines to, and they often went from the Philippines to Taiwan to Japan, and along that journey was really brutal. Some people were saved, but many, many were not.
Thank you. We now shift to, and please correct my pronunciation, Jim Dingman or Dingaman? Jim, can you reveal? Yes. You may reveal yourself.
Okay. Well, no. Anyway, I have several questions. Thank you for writing a book like this, because it's a very brave topic to tackle. 30 years ago, I was engaged in a project where I interviewed POWs from Wake Island and from the Philippines. Did oral histories with them. And what I was struck with was sort of the mixed bag kind of experiences they had, particularly those that went to Japan, because I actually spent hours talking to them about it, because they had sort of uneven experiences. Some had great experiences, some had bad experiences, but it was not the kind of picture I had concerning, what the stereotypes were. Although the POWs captured in battle, they didn't have a walk in the park. So my questions are, one, at Bolt Hall at Berkeley at that time, at the 50th anniversary of World War II, there was a big, huge conference that I attended because I was there taking care of my mother on the reparations issue of prisoners of war. And the key focus in there was on the San Francisco Treaty and the politics of that. And basically, I was wondering what your understanding of how that issue has evolved in different countries since then, in how this affects the question of reparations of POWs. And secondly, at that time, as you well recall, there was a whole bunch of works that came out that talked about how the Japanese were going to kill every prisoner of war if the invasion had occurred, or the people were talking about how we were barely saved in the nick of time by the dropping of the bomb. And that's a common feeling that many of that generation have. So I wonder if you could address those.
Thank you for those questions. I think you'll really enjoy my book, because you kind of get to two of the main points that I talk about. And I would also, if you still have recordings or records or memories of those interviews you did, I would love to hear more about them. So maybe you can shoot me an email and we can discuss those. So the comments that prefaced your questions, I'd just like to say that the Wake Island, the people who came from Wake Island, many of them are civilian contractors. And so then one of the surprising things to me is that they're held together with Allied POWs in Fukuoka, right? And so in the chapter of my book that covers that, you will see a lot of information about that. And this is one of the things that I found so strange when I was reviewing it, or surprising really. It's just the varied experiences that that the same people had depending where they went from camp to camp. And it really never stopped surprising me. All right, so that's what I'll say about that. And then you asked this question about reparations. This is still a live issue. The people who, and there are NGOs and governmental agencies that organize POWs to seek reparations. Most of this is right now. There have been there's people doing research on it and people in Japanese courts still suing for it. That mostly the people who are suing now are people who are suing companies who are, they're forced laborers who are forced to work and are trying to recover their payment from Mitsubishi and some other places. And I can direct you to some readings on that if you want to learn more about what's going on. In terms of your second question, kill all the POWs. Yeah, this is something that I got really interested in. I haven't found evidence of a central order to do this. What I did find this, when I went deep into the ways that the organizations behind former Allied POWs are, they have like a lot of groups online and a lot of websites that where people can ask questions and you get replies. There's a document that's often put up there, and it is also something that came up during the war crimes trials, and it is a document that comes, I believe, from a camp in Taiwan. And it's a document that people use to demonstrate that, to show that the Japanese had sent out this order. But in fact, it's an order, when I looked into it a little bit more deeply, I found that it was an order from the camp asking if they should, what they should do what the people in the camp should do when the war ended. And in what I've said, by no means do I mean to sort of gainsay or deny the fact that many people, that people all over, particularly in the South Pacific and elsewhere, died and suffered horribly, but I didn't find evidence of that being a central policy. All right, I hope that answers your questions, and I hope to hear from you to hear more about the interviews that you did and any records you have of that, because that is just fascinating to me.
Thank you, Jim. I understand Jim is a friend of the Institute, and that he's actually so earnest in attending that he's on his phone, not his computer, in order to hear it, which is interesting. I didn't know you could Zoom a talk on your phone, so excellent news. I notice we're waiting for a few more blue hands perhaps to come up, and in the interim, I'll use the time to push you on this really interesting map that you showed us of the POW movement around the empire. That it's in your book, but it's also, of course, one of your slides, because it really kind of puts Taiwan and Korea back in the center of imperial importance. And of course, you talk about this in your book. And I was struck on my own work to discover that General Jonathan Wainwright actually meets with the Red Cross Juneau at the end of the war, but he's taken in the Philippines, and then he has this horrific experience of being beaten in Taiwan, and at the end of the war, he's in Manchukuo. Can you talk, and this I think ties in with the idea of POW/labor. So we've been talking a lot about the idea of POW, but a lot of these men were put in difficult circumstances and moved around, as you alluded to, because of labor needs or labor abuses by both the Japanese military, but also private companies. So 2 questions really. What is the role within the empire of Korea and Taiwan as staging grounds for POW transport? And how do you see the intersection of labor, forced labor, and POW? Because of those, of course, play a large role in compensation issues after the war and issues of legality or illegality, both during the war and after as well.
Okay, so first, thank you for that question. I had the map open in front of me, and so Korea and Taiwan, what are their roles? Is I think most of you, if not everybody, knows Korea and Taiwan are part of Japan at this time. They're colonies, during the period that my book goes over, right? And So one important thing to keep in mind about Korea and Taiwan is that this is a place that many of the guards come from. Oh, wait. Oh, you're bringing up the slide. Okay, thank you. So, so being a guard is never a particularly high-ranking job. It still isn't in the U.S. military, because the guards are so low-ranking. In fact, many of the guards who guarded Allied POWs during the war are civilians, right? They're civilian auxiliaries, and many of them are Korean and Taiwanese. And this is another group of people who are interested in seeking reparations. I had the opportunity to talk to the Koreans, at least when some of the former Korean guards, and to the organization that is fighting for them when I was in Seoul a couple of times. But let's see. So Korea is both a place that provides, and Taiwan really, they're both places that provide guard labor, and they're also places that have POW camps. The camps in Korea, which I see in my book, were places that the conditions were relatively better. That isn't the case with Taiwan. In terms of how they work geographically, I think, oh no, this is the wrong map. It's the other map. It's map 14.
The one showing the arrow.
14.
Right.
So while we're waiting for that map, really what I tried to do in this map is it's really a difficult thing to track, but I did the best job that I could in trying to show the extent of prisoners being, and you see it here, of prisoners of war being transported. And as Barak mentioned, these are prisoners who are moved around to serve, to serve Japanese labor needs. And so they are working for a variety of different places. Some of the camps in which they are held, they're working for Japanese, they're working in things like factories or coal mines, or working on civilian engineering programs. But there's in other cases, and we see this in the first example that comes to my mind is in Kushner, but there's also one in Korea. These are camps that are basically that are staffed by private companies and are working on these companies' projects. So the one in what's now in North Korea is a chemical company, the same company that would later be responsible for Minamata poisoning. For those of you who study Japanese history, we'll know a little bit more about that. And in Korea, in the camp that is near in Mitsubishi, the one that people who are working for Mitsubishi in Kyushu, as I mentioned already, are some of the people who are trying to get restitution. All right, I hope that answers that question. I can only see the slide now. Now I can't see Barak. Oh, you're back.
Thanks, Sarah. I see we have several on deck, and Dr. Lankova is our next. Please reveal yourself and tell us where you're from, and unmute yourself as well. Everyone keeps moving around my screen as they unmute.
I know, it's freaky.
Looking for where. Ah, yes, there you are. Okay. You need to unmute yourself.
You can unmute yourself. There you go.
No, now I can, because the host only can unmute. I saw the sign. Anyway, Sarah, congratulations with the book. I'm excited to read it. So I'm Tatiana Linhoeva. I'm from New York University, and I'm working on Japanese history as well. So when I was listening to your presentation, I was thinking about Japanese prisoners of war in the Soviet camps after 1945. And you know, like around 700,000 Japanese soldiers were captured, and around 66,000, between 60 and 70,000 prisoners, Japanese prisoners, died. So in the popular literature, this staggering amount of people, the deaths, right, of those, was usually attributed to the cruelty of the Soviet system, to the Gulag system, and to this, authoritarian and totalitarian Soviet state. And then drop here, communism, and so on. But a lot of it, especially Siberia, right after the Second World War, after all the devastation and hunger and famine and so on. So now, like the recent literature in Russia and in Japan as well, actually Japanese historians are leaders in this field. Now they, emphasize it's just plain mismanagement. Exactly the argument that you do for the Japanese, right, camps around Asia Pacific. So it was also a mismanagement and just simple inability to accommodate, 700,000 people. And so I was thinking. So in Russian studies, as far as I know, it's a way. There's the issue of the prisoners of war, Japanese prisoners of war, is the issue to reconsider, this totalitarian model of the Soviet state. That it's has been debunked, the idea that the Soviet Union was a totalitarian state, but it keeps coming back because it's a very easy explanation, right? And so I was wondering what you can say about the wartime Japanese state, based on this issue of mismanagement and that, it was not just this authoritarian state or, this nationalistic cruelty and so on.
Okay, thank you for the question. So the first thing I'd say, just in thinking about the Japanese held prisoner by the Russians, they're not prisoners of war, which may sound like a small thing. The other thing is, maybe obviously I'm not up to date on the Russian language scholarship, so I can't really talk about that. But I've read the people who write in English on this and some of the Japanese scholarship. But I think the question you're asking is about the totalitarian Japanese state and how this plays into how I'm thinking about Allied POWs. That's right, that's your question. And, I don't know. I mean, I think that the subject of my book really is how it came to be that so many people suffered. And so I think that it's, of course, true that there is that the state is like that, but since they are really not caring at all about prisoners of war in any detectable way, except for me at least, except for the ways in which POWs are moved around to help with the war, right? It almost becomes sort of a parentheses kind of question off to the side. Does that help you understand your question? I mean, is that
we have a question coming in from Dr. Gerstmann, who is the assistant director of the Saltzman Institute.
Oh, thank you. Sarah, I'm really fascinated by the rigor and the extent of your archival research. And how did you decide which archives to go to in person? And while you were there, were there any that were particularly challenging because of the sensitivity of your topic? And then a second question is just, how many years was it from your idea to actually getting to publishing? I mean, I think you might have stated something early on, but how long a process was this?
All right, I'll take the latter part of the question first. So I think I've been working on this for 8 years or so. I spent a year before I started this working on a totally different project, which I rejected, and that was kind of wasted time. But I basically been working on it ever since I stopped working on my first project, because that in a way is how I came here. When I was doing research for my first book which is on sex workers in occupied Japan, I came across, I was in the ICRC. It's not the only place I went, it's been coming up today, but when I was doing archival research there today, I came across these reports that they had written about the camps, that their delegates had written about the camps that they went to. And while I knew a lot about, from talk with people and family and relatives and friends about the experience of being a prisoner, and of course we see so much about it in literature and in films, it wasn't something I had really come across in my studies of Japanese history. So I thought, hey, this is a place for me to learn more. And, it really was a very big thing to start researching it and coming in from nowhere. But I started, I think, and also at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, it's a specific time in U.S. history, and U.S. current events were very influential in me in choosing this topic. Excuse me. But in terms of archival research, I guess I started at the ICRC because I'd seen the reports there. And then when I was at the ICRC, they said, you know, if you really want to know about the civilians, then you need to go to Bern to read about what happened to the civilians. So then, you know, Bern is not far from Geneva, and easy to get to as things are in Switzerland. And so I ended up there, and I guess what I would say my process was I use a database called Evernote, and I would go in and take pictures of the things that I found, and I would read them, and I would sort of go where the archives took me. And so this meant that I had a very big list of camps that I started out with, and then I narrowed my focus to looking at camps in different places. And then, I went there, and in terms of archival experience that was challenging, you know, I was in India, and I was in a particular place, and that was challenging because you had to write about what you were researching, or they wouldn't show you the right papers. But that was maybe that was my fault, because I wasn't specific. They wouldn't let me be as broad as I wanted, so that was a little bit challenging. I was in the narrow library, I think. But in terms of really what was challenging, I think I was challenging. I went to I want to say reunion, but it isn't a reunion, a meeting of for Allied POWs, for American POWs, for survivors of the Philippines, and for their children. And it was very challenging there so a number of them agreed to talk to me, and I was very grateful for people to take the time to talk to me. And I found more than that, POWs, those who survived were of course very old now. More than they were very gracious to me and told their stories, but their children were very concerned with how this story was told. And their children were very, they only wanted to tell a particular story, and they would kind of remind their fathers of the story they wanted to tell. And I found that, so my job is just to listen, but I found out some interesting stuff. But that experience I found very challenging. For me, just reading, that's easy, and I read quickly, and I can work in a number of languages, but that was for me, that was really challenging for me, especially since the year that I went was the first time they had ever invited a Japanese person there, and this was the son of the guy who came. He worked in a flower store. He was a florist, and he was the son of somebody who had worked on one of these ships. And he was saying all this stuff in Japanese that would have made these people crazy if they had known. He was saying how the conditions. My father suffered so much, and all this, and then the translator wasn't translating it, so that I found very disconcerting. Yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you.
I'm surprised to hear that you don't choose your research topics by where the best restaurants are. That's normally the way I go about doing my research. We have Dr. O'Dwyer, who I believe is at Oberlin, if I'm not mistaken, who's been very patient and has to rush off to class very soon. But if you could unmute yourself, I'll do it for you. There you go.
Can people hear me? Okay, great. Hi, Sarah. Hi, Barak. Please call me Emer, not Dr. O'Dwyer. Name's pronounced with a strong E at the front. Yeah, thank you, Sarah, for this. And let me start by saying I haven't read it, so I'm not going to ask the question. I haven't read it, but I really won't. But I did want to just add two quick things, and I intend to read it very soon. But one is that, just as a sort of strange anecdote, and give you a moment to pause and maybe a moment of levity in discussing this very difficult stuff. I received an email 2 or 3 days ago from someone from Bahrain asking me to psychoanalyze his dream that he dreamed about a Japanese Imperial Army commander who had let out some of the Chinese who were being kept in a POW camp, and that he woke up and he knew that he felt as if he was a reincarnation of this man, and did I know any of the details of such and such an instance? So it really felt like a bolt from the blue. I don't know if he meant to send it to you, but I couldn't quite discern why me of all people would get this email. So maybe it's something taking the rounds. I haven't responded. But my question is actually, again, it's not one that is presuming anything about an argument that I know nothing about, but wondering if you could simply comment on how if you see your work as telling us more about the wartime Japanese state, especially in the 1940s, or if you see it telling us more about the outcome of the war and the beginning of peace, and having to do with the occupation, but more about how the Allies just if it tells us more about the early 1940s or the late 1940s. So thank you again, and I'll take myself off air here.
Well, thank you for that comment. I haven't gotten it yet. That is something I guess I can look forward to. I get a lot of weird email, but that not yet. All right. So I think that's a great question, Emer. My book is really, it's more like kind of local history in a way. I'm interested in and this was part of what actually was really hard about writing it for me, because there's been a lot of really good work done on the wartime Japanese state, and there's more coming out all the time. But what I tried to do in this book was to talk about what the history was like in Singapore or in the Philippines or in Kyushu or in Korea. So it's more the history of those places and how that link and how a particular camp fits into that context. And that was also very challenging for me because, my first book is, as I mentioned, it's about the Allied occupation, and it's about Japan after the war. And obviously, or maybe not obviously, but I'm not an expert in Singapore or the Philippines. These are really complex places with their own colonial histories. And so that's really what I was trying to do. I mean, the Japanese state, of course, comes in because of the ways, because also major figures in this book it's the Japanese Imperial Army. But the main way I was trying to do this was to talk about the camps and how they fit in, right? So from like the bottom up, more than like a social history approach.
Thanks. I mean, aside from the dream question that Emer just posed, she does kind of touch on the elephant in the room, and which is, of course, Chinese POWs, right? I mean, your book focuses on Allied POWs, and of course, Chinese POWs, being part of the Chinese nationalists, are still allies, but they face, as do the CCP, the Communist Party military, Eighth Route Army and whatnot, they face an entirely different situation. And one wonders when your book moves into Chinese, if people will have the same reaction, because you are making the argument that this was not premeditated, right? That this is an outgrowth of extreme mismanagement and perhaps disregard for human life, but not overt cruelty. And yet with the Chinese POWs, that is what we see. I mean, atrocities in Singapore, atrocities throughout Southeast Asia, atrocities within China, that the military doesn't even bestow the label of POW on China, certainly on the Eighth Route Army ever, and then the Chinese nationalists until December of 1941. So in the aggregate, against the Allies, how do you see the difference? And does this difference between some aspects of Allied POWs being treated better than others tell us something more about really kind of the dark underbelly of the Japanese imperial forces?
I actually meant to mention that. It's on my piece of paper. Great question, Barak, and thanks to your email interlocutor, Emer, as well, for posing this question. So you're absolutely right. China is, of course, a forgotten ally, as has been said. But I think that I do mention the Chinese. They're not treated as allied POWs. Very, very, very few of them are treated under the Geneva Conventions. And there are reasons for that, but the Chinese primarily come into this story in my chapter on Singapore and in other places where you have Chinese who were massacred in Singapore, and the Japanese, this happened on purpose. This is really different than how they, in the main, treated other Allied POWs. And I think that's very important to mention. Yeah, thank you for
Does that tell us more about the structure of the Japanese, or the structure of the Japanese military or the state, going back to Dr. Linkova's point, or does it tell us more about the disarray that was the Japanese military, or their indifference to humanity? I mean, where should we lay layman responsibility?
Well, I think you're kind of in both places, right? Because I think that in terms of what's going on the ground in Singapore, the way that where my archival journey took me is that the people the same guards and commanders who are handling things in Singapore on the ground had come from fighting in China, and they had experienced some brutal fighting there, and they came up with policies to treat the Chinese differently. They were always, and the way that it links up with that, and ordered massacres that are horrendous, and there's been a lot of work that's been done on that. But it, that is the policy to treat them differently, I guess, as a state policy. And because and part of that is explained through international law, saying it's an undeclared war and they should be treated differently. But it's complicated, right? Because even though Japan says that it's following the Geneva Conventions, mutatis mutandis, it's not as if that's a very special reading of the Geneva Conventions, but that is the explanation that is given.
It's a real interesting, as you're telling us, there's one very careful eye always to international law, one careful eye within the disorganization to what's happening on the ground. And then you're also saying we need to look at the background, the transit that troops came from, to see what they felt they were going to meet at the local area. So kind of three forms of influence that shape the outcome of how the prisoners would be treated, not just relying only on a cultural trope. I see that we have Dr. Matthew Connolly of the History Department, who is going to pose a question. I think you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Hi, thank you. So I have read the book. I'm Sarah's partner, so I got a sneak peek before almost anyone else, I think. But one thing, growing up in the US, and not really having a Japanese history background, I found quite striking was that in the US, you think of the history of Allied POWs like it's in one compartment. And then you grow up, even now in like secondary school, even primary school, you read about the history of Japanese who were interned in the United States. You think of that, it's in this other compartment, right? But one thing from reading the book, I was really struck by is how these were not separate compartments, certainly not from the point of view of the Japanese government. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit about how it is that these histories, actually are connected in quite important ways, even in causal ways, in terms of thinking about what happens both to the internees and to the POWs.
So you can all tell that I got the good Zoom background. But all right, so Matt's asking, and thank you for bringing this up, and thank you, Barak, for explaining my book better than I can, I think. But the question, one of the other things that really surprised me as I was doing this research was the very real ways in that the internee history is linked up with the history of Allied POWs in Japan. The first thing to say before I talk about that is that the way that this history is taught is that we in the United States learn about American POWs or Japanese internees in the United States. And in Britain, much of the scholarship focuses on British POWs. In Australia, it might be about Australian nurses. And so that reflects how the archival documents are held. So that was one of the challenges that I faced in this book, was to try and weave all of these different sources together. So one of the very early things that I found out when I was doing research in Washington, D.C. at the U.S. National Archives was I came across the cables that Tokyo and Washington were sending to each other during the war. And in these cables, and it's hyperbole a little bit, but the Japanese were very concerned with what was happening with Japanese internees in the internment camps in the United States. And they were, you know, they were not so concerned with their POWs. They didn't really care that much about them. Japanese POWs, although the U.S. held, of course, POW camps for Japanese POWs. But by contrast, the United States was very, very concerned with what was happening to American POWs and and as for the United States, if you were kind of like, I guess, dumb enough or for whatever reason you couldn't get yourself out of Tokyo, with the exception of diplomats who were transferred, they didn't really, was not a main focus of US policy or concern. And so they're exchanging memos to each other through the war. And one of the, so it was surprising to me in the first place to find this rich diplomatic cable series. And then later on at the diplomatic archives in Tokyo, I found the other side of it, right? The Japanese side of it. And that was interesting as well in the Spanish who are representing them. But that one of the reasons that I think these negotiations failed was that they wanted different things out of them. And one of the principles behind prisoner of war exchange is reciprocity, according to the Geneva Conventions. And there's no reciprocity if you're talking about civilians who at that time weren't covered by the Geneva Conventions. They are later, and versus POWs.
Thanks. Sorry, you just switched on my, you just moved on my screen again. We have, I was just going to ask a question about Dr. Koga's book, but she has upended my question because she has raised her own blue hand. So Dr. Koga, who's now newly installed at Yale, I believe, can you do the reveal and unmuting as well? Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and congratulations, Sarah. I haven't had the chance to read the book, but now I'm more interested in actually picking up the copy and going through it. And since I haven't read the book, it might be a mistarget question, but I'm just wondering if you could tell us more about the nature of camps as a category, that having seen all these variations of practices in those various camps, what you find as the nature of these POW camps. There have been a lot of theorizations about the nature of various forms of camps, from the refugee camps to these POW camps. If it's those camps were the state of exceptions, or is it the extension of the essence of empires, or it comes back to the many iterations of the questions that raised about the nature of the imperial state, but also what was it a kind of zone of exception? Was it in a way the epitome of what the empire meant, or where do you locate conceptually these camps within the idea of empire, and also that has the nature of camp changed with the dissolution of empire or the end of the war? I'm just interested to know, how do you see the location of camps within the process of empire, and the dissolution of empire, that as you saw through these various manifestations? I don't know if I'm making it clear, but.
Okay, so your question is, and correct me if I'm wrong, are you asking how the Japanese see their camps, or are you asking how they function theoretically in terms of the Japanese state, or for whom? How is it? I don't really understand. I'm sorry.
You muted yourself.
Okay, I think I have voice now. So I'm just wondering what the role of these camps within the Japanese imperial state, that was part of it. And the way I heard from your presentation and the following conversation was that was almost accidental kind of site, rather than the kind of planned site within the imperial project. But So if it's accidental, was it kind of still a state of exception type entity for the Imperial project, or was it become the kind of part of the machinery of empire? What is the role of those camps, conceptually for the Japanese empire that played or that came to play within the process? Is that clearer?
Yeah. So I have two answers for you. I think that in terms of the establishment of the camps themselves, I think that there was not a policy plan. It was sort of made on the ground, and that it was not. And so therefore, it's actually really interesting and surprising, to me at least, when I think about Japanese empire, how they ended up working. And I think about this most in a place like Korea, right? Where the camps that were in, so of course, Korea is part of the empire, and the Japanese, I mentioned already how many guards from Korea came, but one of the points that the Japanese had of setting up camps in Korea, right? And this is said and mentioned, and I've written about it before, not just in this book, is that there was a real plan to set up these camps as propaganda camps, right? To show to Korean nationals just how well the Japanese could treat officers. And for this reason, in lots of different places and lots of different times, you have troops, people taken as a unit to be in a camp. But in Korea in specific, it's British officers who are taken to be in this camp. And they're marched from Busan and then taken by train, just so that, for one reason, so the Japanese could impress Korean nationals with how they were holding these officers prisoner. And in addition to that, this is one of the places, unlike some of the other places, where ICRC inspectors are allowed in, so that the Japanese could show off how well that they were treating captives in this place.
We are slowly running out of time. I think we'll have time for one more question from Dr. Embarrass. And before we get to that question, I mean, it is interesting to think, Sarah, you obviously spend a lot of time in your book talking about the camps, talking about the issues, talking about the kind of wide variety of experiences. And you do talk toward the end of the book then about what is the outcome of that, right? The experience of these individuals and how that pushed them post-war to think about Geneva further conventions and whatnot, and what it means to be a prisoner, and ideas of international law and whatnot. Do you think within military, I'll just throw this question out, I don't think you should answer it because we'll move on to David's question, but are you pushing, or do you think your book will push the field of military history forward in not necessarily thinking about the action during the war, the conflict, the beatings, and the cruelty, which seems so necessary for reality TVs, it seems so necessary for kind of plots of great novels. I often joke I can't write a great novel because I had an idyllic childhood, there was no conflict. You show a lot of conflict in your book, and yet you also show the resolution of that conflict in some ways in the other half. And does that then disappoint the narrative that we were talking about at the beginning of the talk? And you mentioned the children of POW atrocity survivors or abuses as well, who want to have a singular memory of that event and don't want to necessarily, not forget it, but expand that memory to then incorporate what happens afterwards. And I think in some ways your book pushes us to think about the connections between those two realms, which we don't often get in war history, but also in military history. And with that, Dr. Barris, if you could just relatively briefly keep your question not too long, and then we'll have Sarah, and then we'll move forward. And you are unmuted? Yes, thank you.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. I think Barak's question is probably more important than mine, so I hope Sarah will have time to answer that as well. But I was, and in hearing your last response, I had been thinking while you were doing your response to the last question about the propaganda role of the Russo-Japanese War era and World War I era camps, and whether people after 1945 in Japan used that history to reflect on what had happened during the Asia-Pacific War or after 1941. Was this something where Japanese could engage in a kind of a self-criticism, saying we were civilized in quotes, and yet somehow we descended into something other than civilized in the name of Greater East Asian civilization? How do we reconcile those two aspects of our experiences and agency in war times? If I can, when I first logged on, it was the background music was playing and everything, and I couldn't tell what it was, but I thought, oh my God, they're playing "Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence" soundtrack. It was like, it freaked me out for a second there. I'm glad that's not what it was.
So thanks for that question. There are Japanese people who write like that, right? And who have had that kind of reflection. It's difficult, as you know, to sort of say what everybody is saying and what people. So I would say that I've seen that strain of thinking in Japanese historical scholarship, and maybe leave it at that and talk about military history. I think we're at a close, but I just want to say, for so many years, for 20 years, for 30, people have been talking about a new military history. I hope to contribute to that. I mean, really what the kind of military history I'm interested in is, war and society. And so hopefully I've contributed to that. I think it may not really address a lot of the questions that some people who are interested in my work have, but that is really where I'm seeking to make my contribution. Thank you, everybody.